topic to cover today, and Lisa is our behind-the-scenes tech driving the show. I'm Dana. I'll be your kind of MC host, help facilitate, but really, I'm here to hand the main spotlight over to Elisa Kosarin hello, and there'll be plenty of interaction. This is an interactive experience, so take it away and share your screen for all to enjoy.
Absolutely. Okay, everybody, give me a moment while I share my screen. What's going on here?
All kinds of good stuff. And again, we have chat box open. We'll have time for some Q&A during and after. But again, if something comes up as we go through, just let us all know if you have a question or comment or an example to share.
Okay, great. And just so you know, everyone out there, that this webinar is not going to be a one long slideshow. I have a bunch of slides teed up with information that I think you will find useful, but there is a good amount of time also carved away for Q&A. So to begin officially, hello everyone. I'm very happy to be with you today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elisa Kosarin. I'm a volunteer engagement specialist, which means that I consult with nonprofits to help them strengthen their volunteer programs. And I provide a lot of volunteer management trainings like this one. When Todd asked me to lead a webinar on how to hire a volunteer manager, I got very excited because even though I've never formally trained around this topic before, so you all are my guinea pigs today, it's a topic I think about a lot because volunteer management holds a special place strategically in an organization, and it requires skills in all kinds of multiple different domains, perhaps more so than just about any other type of staff position. And I hope that becomes clear to you throughout the course of this webinar. And actually, at one point, I did blog about this question of what to look for when hiring a volunteer manager. And I can put that link in the chat when we're all done here. So as I mentioned, I'm going to spend the first part of this webinar going through this slide deck with all kinds of useful information. And then I do want to open up things for questions. But before we jump in, I am curious. And Lisa, if you could tee up the Slido.
I did already.
Oh
I just teed it up when you clicked. So we are in sync,
Fresh
Alyssa.
Slido.
We are so seamless. But I want to know, I put this webinar together based on my knowledge and what I think is important for nonprofit leaders to know about hiring a volunteer manager. I am curious about what brings you here today. So what do you most want to know when it comes to hiring a volunteer manager? And you'll see I've got a bunch of different considerations up here for you. If you could go ahead.
Yeah, options. If you look at the bottom right of your screen, you should see an option to pick Slido. And if you click on that, this poll should show up for you. And Alyssa, I'll tell you that so far, we've got two 100%. What kind of work experience is relevant? And how to find quality training for a volunteer manager. If some of you can't get the Slido open, feel free to type your responses in the chat as well. Up, and the numbers are changing quickly, Alyssa.
Right.
We're now at, I'm going to take a deep breath and give it a minute because they keep changing. We've got, here's your percent. We've got 14%, which competencies make for a strong volunteer manager. Okay. 43%, what kind of work experience is relevant.
Okay.
25%, which department should house the volunteer program. Oh, that just changed to 33%.
Okay.
22%, how to find quality training for a volunteer manager. 33%, how to best support and supervise a volunteer manager, and 11% other. So
We might dig into the other in discussion as we go along, or again, feel
The
free
other
to
was
put it in the
just
chat.
me.
Todd's other is
You see
chocolate.
how they
I
just
am
do
the
Todd?
other. Yes.
If, okay.
Good to know.
If anyone else has clicked other, I'd be very curious to know what you're thinking. So if there are some others lurking out there, please
Oh,
feel free.
you don't want to know my other, Elisa? I'm wounded. I'm just.
Well, Todd, you're so knowledgeable. I just can't imagine what your other might be.
Oh, that's
But
right. I know
please
everything.
share.
Therefore, there is no other.
So I
Yeah,
am
Dana's-
going to
Dana's
close
laugh.
this poll at this point, but
Okay,
I think your top three are what kind of work experience is relevant, which department should house the volunteer program, and how to best support and supervise a volunteer manager, but everything got some votes.
Okay, well, the good news is that we're touching on all of these topics. So I should have some answers for all of you at one point or another. So let's continue. Here's what we're going to cover in this webinar. We're going to start by talking about what the purpose of a volunteer of having a volunteer program is within a nonprofit organization, because that big picture question does inform the kind of person you hire, the kind of job description you put together, that type of thing. We're going to talk about pre-hiring considerations, such as relevant work experience, for example. Post-hiring considerations, such as where the volunteer manager lives or how to support the volunteer manager. Where to house the volunteer program. And then, as I've said a couple of times, we will have time for your questions. So let's go ahead and talk about this question here. What's the purpose of having a volunteer program? Because when we understand the role of the volunteer manager within the bigger picture, the larger context of the organization, it helps inform the decisions we make about the volunteer manager role down the road. So my question is, what's the purpose of having a volunteer program? To ask it a couple of other ways, why do we even engage volunteers in the first place? When it comes to your mission and vision, what is the purpose? So I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
And I've got the poll up. We've got one comment so far, which is to show appreciation for volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So someone answered that for the purpose of having a volunteer program, or was that a late answer to the other poll?
That might have been a late answer.
That's going to be my instinct, but that's good to know. Thank you,
Yeah.
Lisa. Yeah.
Volunteers help us meet the mission of the organization.
Okay.
To complement the mission of the organization, so we have two people talking about the mission of the organization.
Okay,
To
good.
ensure the safety of volunteers and the organization and the population served. That's a good one, safety.
Yep.
Yep.
So do you folks see these responses coming up, or is it only I who see them?
I cannot see these responses. So Lisa, thank you for summarizing them.
I think, because I'm wondering if when I close the poll, if they'll show up for everyone but Alyssa, but we'll find that out in a minute. Kayla added to bring our community together through support of our organization.
I'm glad community engagement was mentioned. That's terrific.
Oh, and actually one of our participants just told me that they do see the responses. They just have to scroll down to see them through the poll. So that's good to know. Thank you, Anonymous. Another person wrote, to support our healthcare team and improve the patient experience for both patients and their caregivers.
Okay, so to support staff, support clients or patients.
Yeah. I'm going to say that we've gotten 7 responses. We've got about 11 attendees, so I'll see if anyone else answers.
And again, just, technical point, if you're on a phone or something, or Slido is hard to see, or it doesn't work for you, that's why that chat box is open as well.
Yes, and speaking of chat, now I have a follow-on question. You know, you've mentioned community engagement, supporting staff, supporting clients, um, and so forth, you know, in the larger sense, supporting the mission, complementing the mission. So if this is the case, if all of these elements factor into why we even have a volunteer program, then who are the various stakeholders that a volunteer manager has to work with? And I don't think we set up a Slido on this. I'm sorry, Lisa, for that. This was sort of a late breaking question that I added, but who are the stakeholders? For example, I'll give you an easy example. The volunteers
Mm-hmm.
are one stakeholder. So who are some of the other stakeholders? And write the names of those stakeholders in the chat.
Huh. Alyssa, I was sneaky and I just created a poll too that says who are the stakeholders. I'm having
good.
fun playing with this Slido.
Good. I'm glad you can do it like right in the minute. That's true.
And so far we have one response, which is clients.
Clients, yep.
And we know we have volunteers as well.
Mm-hmm. Who else does the volunteer manager interface with so that they can manifest the purpose of the volunteer program?
Upper management,
Mm-hmm.
volunteers, patient staff,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Staff. I'm going to combine patients with clients.
volunteers, administrators / liaisons, the community served, compliance agencies, that's a good one,
Yep.
Ah,
executive leaders,
yep.
other
Leadership.
departments,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you've got quite the list there. Community
Okay.
partners, so both internal and external partners.
Excellent. Anyone else? It's quite a long list, isn't it? I'm going to ask you another question about this soon. In general, though, I ask you to reflect on all of the different stakeholders that a volunteer manager interfaces with. And ask yourself, is that the case for most other staff members?
I think that's a good one to ponder because it's so much relationship management and emotional intelligence that's needed in these roles.
Exactly, Jana. So what I'm doing here, so here is my favorite stock photo of a volunteer manager. I use her all the time. Her name changes, or their name changes from now and then. I think most recently I was calling her Jane. But what I did here is I broke out sort of some of the largest stakeholder categories, just so you can get a graphic of what's happening with the volunteer manager role. So a lot of you mentioned supporting departments, supporting staff, supporting upper management. So that is definitely one large stakeholder category that a volunteer manager must have competency in relating to, is supporting staff and building strong relationships. Then, of course, we have supporting the volunteers. And needless to say, building strong relationships with them to foster greater loyalty and volunteer retention, and make sure that they're satisfied in their roles, all those things that we hope for with volunteers. And then we have the community. I know community engagement was mentioned, building strong relationships there. So as you look at these three categories, you will see that Dana hit the nail right on the head. And I will tell you that she has not seen these slides before. So
this is not scripted. This is all improv.
It's not scripted, but she knew. She knew as a fellow volunteer engagement specialist that building strong relationships is a very important piece of the picture. And then there's one more important piece of the picture, and that is the administrative side. Tracking volunteer data, running background checks, scheduling shifts. Dana, I'm sure you can think of some more things that fall under administration that perhaps I haven't thrown onto the slide here, but this is another area where your volunteer manager absolutely needs to be proficient. So think of how many roles there are out there in your organization where your volunteer manager on the one hand needs really strong interpersonal skills to build strong relationships and needs strong administrative skills because there's a lot happening on the back end. that they need to manage successfully. Okay, so I'm going to throw out one more question for you. As you look at this graphic here, what are some of the skills and abilities and competencies beyond building strong relationships that you think a volunteer manager probably needs to be successful in the role? You can be specific here and go ahead, and Lisa, if you want to create a Slido for this, what are all the different skills and abilities that a volunteer manager needs so they can successfully navigate all of this?
All right, Slido created.
Okay.
Oops, I have to hit the launch button. Sorry, folks. Everybody was probably thinking, where is it? Where is it?
And I'll just answer a question that popped up, and I'm answering it in the chat as well, that yes, a recording of this webinar will be available to reference, again, archived, as well as the slideshow and some other resources we'll talk about a little later and have links to. And that's usually up, a few days to a week after the airing of a webinar is when they get posted on the VSys Voices page, unless Lisa tells me something different.
Nope, you've got it.
Okay, good.
And in the meantime, answers are pouring in. Alyssa, this is a word cloud, so it's kind of cool. We've got words like relationships, verbal, written communications, handling difficult conversations, open-mindedness, time management. Great communication and time management have been mentioned several times.
Yep.
Yeah, what am I missing? Multitasker, caring.
Yep, building verbal, written time. Those are all good word cloud. But yeah, time management, great communication. Not at all a surprise. Those are rising to the top.
Yep. Okay, so I think you're on the right track here as far as the various different kinds of skills and abilities. I'm actually going to come back to that slide. So I want to show you something here, and this comes from the Maine Commission for Community Service. They actually have a terrific handout. I did send it to Lisa and Todd in advance.
And it is posted on this webinar on the intro page, and we will put that handout up on the Voices page as well, just so that folks know. But you can upload it. It's on the invitation or the entry page when you said join webinar as a file to upload.
Okay, perfect. I do hope you download their PDF because it's excellent. They did a lot of research and they created a really thorough handout on all of the competencies that you might need in a volunteer manager. And they've also broken out those competencies, I believe, by entry-level position, more advanced position, and so forth. And the skills and abilities that you just listed, you will see dovetail right into this. They had 4 basic categories of competencies that they believe are important for a volunteer manager. On the far left here, you see managing people. Needless to say, if you're building relationships, that's key. And what that might look like for a volunteer manager is recruiting, screening and interviewing, onboarding, placing, ongoing supervision of volunteers, which would also include things such as the conflict management that was touched on. Just to the right of that, with the orange heading, you have managing projects and programs. A lot of what a volunteer manager does falls in the project manager category. So you've got technology management, policies and procedures that need to be created and enforced and revised, record keeping, budget management, project management, as I mentioned, and risk management, because you're dealing with people. Then to the right of that, in the light blue heading, you've got leading organizations. Most volunteer managers have to do quite a bit of leadership in their roles because it requires a lot of collaboration, not just among volunteers, but also among staff to make sure that volunteers are engaged throughout the organization. A lot of empowering of others, including staff, volunteers, could be community members. Influencing and inspiring others is very important to build up that engagement and that buy-in for a volunteer program, and commitment to the organization's vision and mission. And then finally, in this last category, which I find so interesting, and I'm really glad they included it, you have managing self, which includes ethical conduct, very important in the volunteer world, resilience, the ability to communicate. I know that was included when I was asking for skills and abilities, strong interpersonal skills, and an investment in professional development. So I'm going to go on, but as you look at all of these competencies that are required in a volunteer manager, if you have any observations, feel free to put them in the chat. And Dana, if you could just keep an eye on that. And whenever you think is a good time, please break in and we can talk about that a bit more.
Sure, and as we give people a chance to type into that, I'll say from my experience, the last time I moved on from an agency and was helping to fill the role, there were two candidates who on paper were really, really close together, and it kind of got down to what was their demeanor and interpersonal skills and kind of warmth of personality. And one person was just very, very curt and off-putting, and the other person was a little more easygoing about it. And so sometimes it does come down to that fine of a point, and who's going to be a good fit if they both look pretty good for their paper skills and experience and qualifications. That you can't train someone's inherent personality, but you can train to systems and processes and other skills.
Right. That is a really good point. Really good point. So I presume that you hired the one who had the better.
We did not hire the rude, curt one. No, we did not. We're almost everyone who met that person was like something. It's like, I was like, oh, that's not who we want interacting with everybody all the time.
Gotcha. Okay, not gonna work.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna backtrack if I can. All right. Okay, so for the rest of this presentation, we're going to be covering all kinds of considerations. I've got them in 3 categories. One is pre-hire, things you need to think about, and that would include, as we've been talking about, because it's so important, the competencies needed, the skill level of your volunteer manager, are they entry level? Are they more experienced? Relevant work experience, because not everyone you hire, you may not see a lot of resumes where people have volunteer management on their resume already. You may or you may not. Post-hire considerations, support from the supervisor is huge. So we're going to talk about that. Then we'll talk about training and professional development needs. And then down here in the yellow header, I've got as an organizational consideration, where to house the volunteer program, which perhaps in the most technical sense has, does not affect how to hire a volunteer manager, but it has a lot to do with their success when they're actually in the role. So that's why we're talking about that. Okay, so just to jump through this again.
And
one more thing.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dana.
Oh, there was a good Q&A about hiring personalities that balance the team. And that's if you want to go that extra layer. And some organizations, including ones that I've worked for that have been government agencies, had a very detailed hiring personality test that was part of the screening and onboarding program, even for the first round of candidates. And I've seen very few smaller nonprofits have that ability to kind of take the recruiting process to that level of personality matching and basically psychological kind of screening and testing for that balance. But if you've got an inherent instinct around that, that's a good thing to keep in mind as well, and being careful of our own unconscious or conscious biases around that as well.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. We're not talking too much about that today, but as we always know, that is operating at a deeper level. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, one other thing I want to mention when you are screening resumes, that there are 2 credentials that indicate that someone is extremely accomplished in the field of volunteer management. And those credentials are the CVA, Certified in Volunteer Engagement, and the CAPS. And so if you see these credentials mentioned in a resume, that is something to pay attention to. CVA, and you'll see that after my name, and Dana, of course, I presume you are a CVA, yes?
There's my certificate right there in the background.
Yeah, there you go, perfect. perfect product placement.
I know.
CVA is an international credential. I'm just reading off the slide here for practitioners in the field of volunteer engagement who meet specified standards as measured through a rigorous exam. And the CVA exam covers all kinds of domains, including things like ethics, conflict resolution, policy creation, and so forth. It's very thorough. So when you hire someone with a CVA credential, you have someone who is extremely capable. Now, in the healthcare field, and I know we have people on the webinar today from the healthcare industry, there is a similar credential, the CAVS, Certified Administrator and Volunteer Services. You see this in healthcare settings. This credential also used to be administered by CCVA. It's recently been turned over to the Patient Experience Institute. And so if you're in a healthcare setting and want to learn more about CAVS, this is the link where you can go. Wanted to make sure to mention that. Okay, let's talk about skill levels, because obviously I'm presuming that those of you here today are hiring for volunteer manager positions at different skill levels. So let's do a quick review of the general skill levels for volunteer managers. I would add, these are not official categories. These are my categories. So if you're using a different title, that is totally fine. Hopefully you'll be able to relate to what I'm describing. But oftentimes entry-level positions are deemed coordinator positions. And to me, this is someone who recruits and places probably a relatively small group of volunteers and does not have a lot of supervision responsibilities. Perhaps they're placing volunteers with other staff. That might be a coordinator. Then you have a manager who's recruiting and training volunteers throughout the organization. They may supervise their own direct reports, other members of a team below them. They may also supervise volunteers themselves. In other words, their scope of responsibilities is broader. And then you may have people at the director level. They are often part of the leadership team, often involved in strategic decisions for the organization that involve volunteers, and they often supervise a team. And I'm actually going to ask Dana to weigh in here because recently she did a great Tuesday tips on her YouTube channel about this very question. So Dana, what would you like to add here?
Sure. Well, I also, without coordinating with you, Lisa, because we can have such a huge variety of job titles or hybrid job titles, and it may or may not even have coordinator, manager, director, or the word volunteer in it. But I think this is a good scale. And I put the link to my Tuesday tips, which is about 10 minutes on the similar kind of topic of some highlights. And that coordinator can be entry level, and very often I've seen this split with a nod to your 20 hats business, to several different hats that coordinator might wear. They might be someone who works across a lot of different departments and seems, even if they answer to one person, so that person can have a lot piled on their plate without necessarily a lot of power to make changes. And I think I see the manager as the middle manager. It's going to be more likely that someone with a CVA or CAVS is going to be in that manager or director level, including probably some of you on the call today, if I see some familiar names. But coordinator, in some cases, I think that's where your point earlier, Elisa, is really important, of what are cross-pollinating skills, because other than AmeriCorps, there usually isn't a real career path or major in college for people to have to be a volunteer coordinator, unless you're getting to, Masters of Public Administration and things like that. So, be very welcoming and open about those people skills and communication, and train to everything else for an entry-level coordinator. And then that manager and director hopefully have some say, like you said, strategically, especially hopefully that director title is part of the leadership team and has a seat at the table. And that's really just looking for these extra levels of being able to supervise larger teams and more complex systems as you get to middle and upper management.
Right, exactly. And Dana, you're touching on another important point, is that oftentimes volunteer managers are not exclusively volunteer managers.
Exactly.
They often have other responsibilities within an organization. I hope you are getting a sense already that there is so much involved in successful volunteer management that if you really want to have a successful volunteer program, hopefully you are going to evolve your volunteer manager into a full-time dedicated position. Otherwise, you're really kind of hamstringing yourself as far as how successful your volunteer program can be. It's a question of investing more bandwidth staff-wise into the volunteer program so that you can grow the program and see some of the other benefits as well. For example, there's plenty of research that volunteers who really feel like they belong to an organization and love an organization are generous donors and will give in other ways as they see fit. So more food for thought. We're not going to go too much into that today, but that is something that I do want to bring up. And Dana, thank you for your comments.
Absolutely.
And I do encourage you all to look at Dana's Tuesday tip because it's excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, you are welcome. So let's look at prior work experience. This is usually a big question mark when it comes to volunteer management. As we've mentioned, you may not see a whole lot of resumes, especially more at the entry level stage, of individuals who already have prior volunteer management experience, or perhaps it was a small piece of a former position. So I want to give you a sense of other kinds of work experience that would indicate this person could be successful as a volunteer manager.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I kicked it off with someone who has been a volunteer manager in the past, especially a CVA. That's a given. That's why we started off with that one. Someone with human resources experience can be very successful as a volunteer management. You know, I hope you're getting the sense that there's a lot of overlap between human resources and volunteer engagement. They are not identical. However, they do share, you know, a great many things in common since it's all about supervising people. And it's also a great sort of foundation. If you see someone with human resources experience and background in the admin fundamentals, creating the policies, creating the procedures, knowing how to set expectations with volunteers and so forth. Community organizing usually has a big component of volunteer management within it. Not to mention people who share, you know, sort of the idealism and the vision that you may want in a volunteer manager. So that's certainly a work experience you can look for. Fundraising and volunteer management often go hand in hand. I myself came from a fundraising background before I became a volunteer manager. And I found that extremely helpful in sort of getting the full picture of what it means to bring a supporter into an organization. And also, needless to say, fundraisers have their own volunteer committees as well that they are managing. Social workers often have a volunteer, are great with those interpersonal skills oftentimes. So that's one to consider. Or someone who has been a volunteer in your program. Those are often your best volunteer managers. You know, I got into volunteer engagement because I was a volunteer with a court-appointed special advocates program, a CASA program, and I loved my experience so much that when a position came open to recruit and train volunteers in my CASA program, I jumped at that. And it was an easy transition. The learning curve was probably shorter because I knew what was involved. So certainly looking to volunteers in your own program is always a great place to start. And again, if questions are popping up as you see these slides, please feel free to throw them in the chat.
Yeah, the chat and the Q&A, I'm keeping an eye on those, and feel free to chime in or just absorb the information.
Okay, yes, exactly. There you go. Okay, so let's talk about some post-hire considerations, especially how the volunteer manager supervisor can best support them. And to my mind, there are three main areas, not exclusively three main areas, but here are three main areas to think about. The first one has to do with setting or affirming expectations for staff collaboration. To me, this is the very best way that you can support your volunteer manager. And that's because this is often a huge challenge for the volunteer manager is to get the buy-in of fellow staff members to work with volunteers, to engage them in the first place, to know how to supervise them. And it's ironic because often there is a general expectation that the staff is going to do that. However, it hasn't been explicitly stated by leadership that staff is expected to do that, or perhaps there has been no provision in their budget for staff engagement, or perhaps in the performance plans of staff, they are not measured on how much they collaborate and engage volunteers. All of those pieces need to be placed to make the volunteer manager's job easier. Without those clear expectations from leadership that this is an important part of working within your nonprofit, you're going to find that that's another thing that's going to hamstring your volunteer manager and hinder the growth of your program. The second is to allow for budgetary needs. Volunteer service may be free, and I know you all know this already. However, managing a volunteer program is not. And so you want to make sure that you are providing your volunteer manager with a sufficient budget to run their program efficiently and effectively. And that includes sufficient technology, having a volunteer management platform such as VSys. In fact, I'll mention before we began the webinar, we were just talking about how so many volunteer programs still operate on spreadsheets to manage all of the different functions of volunteer management.
Or paper records or some weird hybrid of Excel and Google calendars and things like that. And like it's better to have it all in one database. It pays for itself pretty soon. Yeah.
It does. And especially if you want to be future thinking as far as where you want your program to go, you want to make sure that you have a platform that is going to grow with your program so that your volunteer manager is not constantly scrambling to catch up. And you want it to be able to house, and then as for other budgetary needs, of course, background checks are often a high dollar item, depending how many volunteers you engage. Volunteer appreciation is important, making sure that you provide a budget for that. Dana, are there other budget issues that I haven't thought of that might be good to include?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be several depending on the industry, but I think the most important is the salary of the person because this is a role or an industry that's traditionally under-resourced. And to your point, Lisa, volunteers aren't free. It takes investment, and there is a return on that investment. And just an absolutely average statistic from a former client of mine, which is a major municipal zoo, we did the calculations, and for every dollar that they spent on volunteer services or volunteer resources, including staff salaries, they got almost $9 in returned value of not just in kind of how many hours, but for people overlapping as donors and doing extra community outreach and just having those relationships quantified was a really important metric to measure. And so making sure that as much as you can push the budget to get a higher salary that's a livable wage, especially at that entry level, that's going to help keep talent and develop it internally to go through to be manager, director, and have that kind of growth.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Yes, and a good place to start for salary considerations is the Volunteer Management Progress Report, and we can get that link for you. That is put together by our colleague, Toby Johnson, a Volunteer Pro. She does a very extensive survey annually of volunteer managers and always asks about salary levels so that we can do some benchmarking within the profession.
Yeah.
So if you're unsure what salary to offer for your volunteer manager role, that is definitely a resource to refer to. Okay. And then finally, invest in volunteer management professional development. This is especially important if you have an entry-level volunteer manager. You're going to want to ensure that they have proper training. There are lots of best practices around volunteer engagement that an entry-level volunteer manager may not know walking in the door. In fact, they probably won't. And you're saving them a lot of time and aggravation, and you're ensuring that your program is going to run more efficiently and effectively if you give your volunteer managers the training that they need. If you think back to the list of competencies that we reviewed, you'll remember that volunteer managers need to be proficient in multiple areas. And when you're hiring, it's unlikely that, or less likely that you're going to have a candidate who's 100% proficient in all of those areas. You're going to want to shore up their strengths in certain areas and make sure that they have the training they need.
And I've put the link to Toby's latest research, just the page on her blog that's easiest to find in the chat. And again, we'll have this on the VSys Voices resources pages later as well.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's talk about some of those resources. This is not an exhaustive list. There are really quite a few really excellent volunteer management resources out there. But let's start with these. The first would be, as VSys members, you have access to VSys webinars, which are incredibly chock full of information and cover a lot of really important, relevant topics. So make sure, of course, that your volunteer manager has access to those. There are some professional associations related to volunteer engagement that, and this would go under budget as well, that you would want to make sure that your volunteer manager is a member of. Starting with the Association of Leaders in Volunteer Engagement, that's our national association. The acronym is ALIVE. They do an excellent annual conference, a hybrid conference. The Minnesota Alliance for Volunteer Advancement, even though they are a state organization, is really top-notch. They also do an excellent annual conference, and they have really become the leaders in diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion issues around volunteer engagement. I know that's where I go when I want to learn more around DEAI. I go to VAVA. Volunteer Match has great free of charge webinars for volunteer managers. Your local volunteer centers, wherever you live, generally have great trainings for volunteer managers. They often do volunteer management 101s and so forth. I'm in the Northern Virginia area, and my local volunteer center, Volunteer Fairfax, is excellent. They do a boot camp kind of training and an advanced kind of training. In addition, the woman who heads up professional development at Volunteer Fairfax, Susan Sano, has really made it her goal to provide lots of free, high quality webinars and discussions and make those available to volunteer managers. And so I encourage you to look at Volunteer Fairfax. The Engage Journal is probably one of the leading journals within our profession, where peers submit articles around their best practices. Volunteer Pro, we just mentioned, that is Toby Johnson's organization, which puts out the Volunteer Management Progress Report. And then there are some blogs and other resources that I would definitely encourage you to take a look at. There's my blog, which is now an archive. I'm no longer actually actively writing for it, but I have over 150 blog posts there. That's the 20 Hats blog. Our colleague Meridian Swift has a wonderful blog for volunteer managers called Volunteer Plain Talk. And I really do encourage you to take a look at Dana's Tuesday Tips, her priceless advice, because it is priceless, and you will find lots of detailed information that will be relevant to you.
And thank you, Todd, for putting all of the links to these things in the chat. And again, we're going to have links posted on the VSys Voices resource page, but Todd is on it. Dropping
Yes,
those links. He's dropping those links into the chat. Thank you, Todd.
Okay, the links are dropping as we speak. Okay, that is great. All right, thank you, Todd. Okay, so finally, where should the volunteer program live? This is not technically a hiring issue, as I mentioned, but placing the volunteer manager in the right department is really important for ensuring that they're fully supported and positioned for success. And even as I say that, I want to stress that there really is no one right department for housing a volunteer program. And that's why I have this written here on the slide, that your best rule of thumb is to house the volunteer program where it's easiest for the volunteer manager to build relationships across departments. So obviously a lot of that may have to do with the relationship between the volunteer manager and their supervisor, and making sure that they have the support, no matter what department they're in, to reach out to other departments and to their coworkers to make sure they can engage volunteers wherever they are needed.
And we're getting some Slido results. So if you haven't noticed, I think almost everybody on air with us has, but you can fill out your Slido. And if you're like me and it's like, oh, the departments I worked in were education or public affairs or something like that, I put specific program. But it looks like because a lot of you today are in the hospital healthcare industry, patient experience is coming in as the leader of the Slido poll so far, human resources. Specific program areas or the catch-all others. And we haven't had any development or direct report to executive director operations yet, which is interesting because I agree, Lisa, those are really common places for this department to live if it isn't its own report to the executive director of volunteer services department. But looks like for today's attendees, patient experience is by far the winner with 63% so far, followed by human resources, 38%. We just had operations come in and specific program area are each tied at 11%.
Okay. Okay, that's excellent. And I apologize for not having patient experience up here. That shows that I come to volunteer engagement from a different sector and I'm not that familiar with it, but certainly that would rank up here too. You know, just recently in May, I did a conference session on this topic for the American Alliance of Museums annual conference, and I had panelists who reported as volunteer managers to human resources, to visitor services, to education, and then I had one volunteer manager who's rotated through all of those departments, and they shared about their experiences. And the big conclusion for the panelists and for the audience was that it's really a question of breaking down the silos and just making sure wherever the volunteer program is housed that they do have that access. And if you have any more questions about this, please throw them in the chat. Okay, so that concludes the slide presentation and discussion, and I am curious about your questions. Dana, what are you seeing as far as questions?
Not so much in the chat or the Q&A so far, so I'll give folks a moment to do that. And also, we might have the power with Lisa to unmute people if they indicate in the chat that they want to be unmuted. Or Lisa, do people have the power to unmute themselves in this new tech setup?
Well, you know, let's have Karina tell us if she can unmute herself.
That's a good test subject, someone we know.
But I definitely can unmute people if people either raise their hand or Karina says she cannot. So if you would like to be unmuted, either put it in the chat or use those cute little hand raising icon there at the bottom of the bottom of the screen, and I will unmute you. Or I did put up a poll question that says, any questions or ideas to share? Kayla did say that she has no questions, but that this was a really helpful session. Her words were great and very helpful. I should quote her directly.
Good, that's the hope that this was helpful.
And I'll say that I like to think of the relationship between whether it's housed in HR or it's its own department, that it's two sides of the same coin. HR's job is to take a lot of different candidates and whittle it down into one job. So screening out a lot of people to one job. And it's the inverse is true of volunteer services. We want as many people as possible to be able to do the same role.
That's a wonderful way to look at it. It's quite an image too.
Yeah, and so if you're housed in HR, sometimes there can be that if the HR director doesn't come from the volunteering sector, that's a really good conversation to have. So because it can be a very different approach from someone running an HR department to eliminate candidates, and as volunteer services, we want to open up the roles and the positions to as many candidates, filling them as constantly as possible.
Dana, you just got a kudo for that, how that's an excellent way to put that.
Yes.
And we have one Slido comment that somebody had to run to another meeting, but this was a really great session. And we have if deciding between a person who's great with people versus a person who's great with technology, data analytics, which would you favor out of curiosity?
You got my answer already, but I'll let I'll let our main star answer.
Right, exactly. Yes, Dana gave a great example earlier. Um, I would also lean towards the interpersonal skills because
But do
it's
you
so.
think if you had several people in that role and you had 3 people who are already great at people, maybe that would change the dynamic?
It could depend on the configuration of the department, and it could be that perhaps within volunteer administration that someone is specializing. Um, if the person who asked that question wants to share more background
If you want to
about
unmute and talk
that
about it,
question,
we've
that
got a
would be
few
great.
minutes.
Yeah, please unmute.
Yeah, because I know sometimes we struggle because we have a lot of good people, but at the same time, we're learning VSys technology, and there's so much you can do technically and so much you could automate if you had that person that was good with technology and who could generate the reports that the C-level
Yes.
wants to see. So I kind of, that's why I wondered.
Well,
Yeah,
and those,
yeah, and
they're
that's
not.
why it's a challenging position because you do need both.
I can say my background before I was an entry-level volunteer coordinator in like 2002 in Project Open Hand was I was an engineering project manager. I looked at blueprints, I talked to people all day, I negotiated things, I wrote up contracts, and I happened to have an extrovert, fun, friendly, warm personality. So they're not mutually exclusive. And I was already pretty good at technology. So I mean, that's always what to aim for is can someone be really proficient in project management or systems thinking and maybe technology. But again, in my most recent example, a few years ago when I went full time and left my agency, in backfilling my role, which was an upper middle management role, someone with again, pretty close to each other on paper, but the more friendly people person had a little bit less technical experience, but then it wasn't that hard to train that person up to the systems I had helped create, and here's the manual. So I think it depends on if that's at the coordinator, manager, or director level that you're hiring into, and what are they coming from? Are they coming internally, or are they moving laterally from another agency where where people face-to-face people relationship stuff wasn't as much of their job. I'd be careful about that. The higher up you are, you have probably more administrative duties happening at the manager and director level, so you might be able to get away with that. But ultimately, you're creating relationships and you're creating a sense of welcoming and belonging, ideally for the whole team and the community that you serve, and especially the volunteers. And I've just found you can't untrain somebody's sour personality. You just can't. There's not enough webinars or sensitivity workshops in the world for a certain
That's a lot
communication
of
style
questions.
or a certain cold demeanor.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I train around a lot, I did a webinar for VSys earlier in the year around this, or maybe it was last year, is on behavior-based interviewing skills. And if, technical proficiency is something that you want to assess, make sure that you're asking questions around that so you can determine, number one, their proficiency, but even more important, their coachability.
Yeah.
Because some people are more coachable than others. And, I often encourage volunteer managers to look for coachability when they're interviewing volunteers. Is this somebody who can be brought up to speed, even if they're struggling a little bit at first? Same thing applies when you're hiring a volunteer manager.
I think that's just great advice across any kind of workspace in any kind of sector is someone capable of self-reflection and learning and growth? Are they interested in that? And does the culture of the whole agency support that in a healthy way and support that professional development? And I've been fortunate enough to be in with a lot of agencies that did support me getting my CVA and going and speaking and pursuing, other education and leveling up in information or writing articles. And that's rare, but it's a great thing to have. And if anyone here today is in a position to help create that culture of welcoming and belonging and personal professional growth, that's really going to help people thrive anywhere that they're starting from coordinator, manager to director.
Right, right.
Well,
Yes.
we don't have anything else in the chat or the Q&A, but we've got a lot of thank yous and very insightfuls and a lot of gratitude and we're pretty close to the top of the hour. We have a few more minutes. So I just want to see, Elisa, do you have any final words of wisdom to share? Or if Todd has anything that you want to chime in, because you're in this work as well.
No, a male voice in the middle of this workshop.
It's
So
balance. It's balance.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, on the subject that we were talking about a minute ago regarding who to hire, whether they be technical or interpersonal, I'm going to vote more on the technical side, just because in today's world, and this is a nod to the topic, Dana, that you and I were presenting at the ASTC conference last week, technology is critical for interpersonal. We have to be able to get, especially with the younger generations, we have to be comfortable, unfortunately, with Facebook and Twitter and all of those things. And by comfortable, I mean enjoy it and be wandering around the streets with it, even on our lunch breaks, and be addicted to it. And it just, I mean, it's really going to depend, honestly, on the requirements of your particular situation and, what kind of volunteers you are recruiting. If they are younger, then I vote technical, because these folks are naturally social, but they're social through the
Todd,
tech.
you already got a kudo from Jenny on that.
Yep.
No, and I think it's important
Thank you,
to
Jenny.
thank you, and thank you, Todd. I think it's important to reframe that these are not at all mutually exclusive. And if you are in Gen Z, older Gen Z or younger millennial, and that's the population you're working with, that's already there for the most part. And the majority of people have that technological ease. So I just want to be careful we're not stereotyping that IT nerds are unfriendly or
Right.
or friendly people don't know how to use social media. I think again, depending on the background of the people that you're working with and the community you're in, and there's variations among different age groups, but it's pretty easy to find that balance, I think. But in my case, filling a role, there are people almost exactly the same on paper, and there was a personality and communication style difference that we realized was going to be the most important piece to success.
There you go. Yes. And I have seen volunteer managers tripped up many times when they need to resolve conflict, when they need to hold difficult conversations with volunteers. Those are often the biggest hurdles for volunteer managers. The things that they struggle with the most until they become comfortable with them.
Mm-hmm.
So I second Dana there.
And thank you so much. We're just at our time. Thanks for spending this hour with all of us in the VSys Voices. Thank you, Elisa Kosserin, for joining us and being the specialist in the spotlight today. I always learn so much whenever we have any kind of conversation, but especially in these kinds of webinars and workshops where we're able to be present together. And again, all of this will be archived and on the VSys Voices resource page, and you should get an email with a follow-up. Is that what do you think the timing is, Lisa, on the email with the links? Next week sometime?
We don't usually do an email with the links. We usually just put it up on the Voices page.
Gotcha. So you can check the Voices page in a little bit, and we'll have this
in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah,
We'll
2
give it
weeks.
2 weeks.
We have to get through the second workshop first, because we picked between the two.
That is true. Excellent.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Have a good rest of the week.
Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.